Welcome, everybody. Obviously, a little disappointed by the size of the crowd, but it's 6:30 on Friday. My name is Don Brown. I'm scholar in residence and professor at Widener University School of Law, where I teach ethics and law and climate ethics and climate law and human rights law. I've been involved in this, as several in the room that I see here have been involved in this process for a very long time. My antenna tells me that the subject we're about to talk may be at the top of the list of practical things that need to be done for reasons which hopefully I will make clear. I'm lucky to have Graham Kennedy, Kennedy Graham, I'm sorry, who is lucky. He's a member of the New Zealand delegation. He's been involved in this for a real long time. I'm going to introduce him a little bit more when we get to him. Now, let's see. Okay, so what I have discovered is almost no one in the world that we can tell really understands how you have to set a greenhouse gas target now that Paris has set a serious warming limit. That sounds counterintuitive. I make that claim and people say, no, people know how to set a greenhouse gas target. They've been doing it all the time. But I continue to test the hypothesis, and one of the tests is I had a research project with Prue from University of Auckland, and we got 23 researchers to test how the INDCs were put together before Paris. What actually did they do, not what they said that they did. And the first part of what we found out is not surprising, that all 23 countries, the target was set, at least in part, not on what is legally required under the treaty, which is to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with climate change based upon equity or common but differentiated responsibilities, but all countries set the target actually on economic self-interest to a certain extent. The problem was that you couldn't tell that from the INDC. In fact, half of the countries said that the target was both ambitious and fair, but when you looked at the submission, there's no way you could link the two in the submission. It's simply a bold-faced claim that the targets were ambitious and fair. I'm going to argue that we have to expect countries to report on about 10 or 15 things to make any sense of those claims. The other thing, there is almost no discussion in the United States, zero discussion that I've seen, where everyone, every time I start talking about this, the grieving about what just happened in the United States starts to come up. That what Obama, there's almost no discussion, certainly none in Pennsylvania, none among the environmental groups. What precisely was wrong with the Obama commitments? Okay, how does the Obama commitments, what is required to limit warming to 2 degrees centigrade, not to mention 1.5 degrees, I have seen no serious, sophisticated discussion of the issue. There's something called the Clean Power Plan, which Obama also did in the United States. I've attended hundreds of hearings on it, and the environmental groups simply supported the Clean Power Plan, which they should have done, I think, that because it was such a step forward from what the United States would have done under the Bush years. But I saw no witness talk about why the numbers in the Clean Power Plan were seriously short of a 2-degree warming limit, and why was that the case? A couple months ago, I brought all the leaders of environmental groups to Widener Law School to ask them if they knew how to set a target and to explain to them something the press still has not seriously talked about in the US to this very day. A lot of the press, including the New York Times, reported pretty seriously on the Paris Agreement, but no one talked about the civilization challenging nature of the emissions reduction targets that would be required, particularly if developed countries took a 1.5 degrees C warming limit. At the meeting of the environmental groups, so you probably know that 1.5 degrees centigrade, according to UNEP, requires the whole world to go to net zero carbon in the industrial sector and electricity sector, zero between 2045 and 2050. You have to go to zero to achieve a 1.5 degrees centigrade limit. I have seen no discussion of that in the United States. In the meantime, the natural gas industry is saying natural gas is great. I was asked to give a talk to the Pennsylvania legislature, and I completely shocked them because no one else has said it. If you have to go to zero, you not only have to get a coal, you got to get out of natural gas in 30 years. And any serious U.S. target, if you take any half-serious equity position, would mean that the United States should be zero between, reasonable people can disagree what the date is. I've argued between 2035 and 2040, the U.S. should be zero, okay? No one, occasionally some of the environmental groups. So anyway, I brought the environmental leaders of the state of Pennsylvania and I walked them through the math, as I'm going to right now, and explain to you why you have to seriously take a warming limit into account if you promise to achieve a warming limit, and how that would radically change how you actually quantify a target. None of the environmental groups had ever thought about it before. When I mentioned that the practical significance of this for Pennsylvania is that Pennsylvania should set a zero carbon target between 2035 and 2040, the environmental groups all said they were shocked. Okay, these are sophisticated, careful, compassionate people, but they really had not thought about, at least this conclusion I have, about the practical significance of a warming limit of 1.5 degrees centigrade. They then told me they weren't going to talk about it. Okay, and I was even more shocked. I almost fell off the chair. Okay, and they said they weren't going to talk about it because the state legislature doesn't even believe that climate change is real. How are they going to tell them that you have to go to zero sometime in the next 3 decades? And so the environmental groups aren't talking about it either, okay? So there's a lot of evidence I have from detailed research, from my experience, that people don't understand the practical significance of a carbon budget. What happened in Paris changed everything, and for reasons that I will explain. There are a lot of people who have been setting carbon targets for 30 years, but how did they do it? They set a greenhouse gas, the inventory, they figured out where the greenhouse gases were coming from, they figured out what technology changes they could make to different sectors, and they figured out whether they could afford them, and then they said, okay, we can afford it, and then they changed the number based simply on that. There has never been an attempt, I was the lead for the state of Pennsylvania on these issues. I talked to other states. There was never been an attempt to think about how you set a target if you have to set a warming limit. Zero. The New York Times is completely failing to talk about it. A couple states that did take it seriously, they defaulted to this IPCC chart, which was in the 4th assessment, which broke down 450 part per million, which is 66% 2 degrees centigrade raise between developed and developing countries. And the United States target for long-term target was in fact based upon this. Everyone's completely ignored that it was a range to begin with. Okay, it was never, when anyone took it, they took the lower end of the range without fully understanding it. And none of them understood that this data is now 15 years old. It's a 2007 report. It was based upon 2005 data. If you understand a carbon budget, you've got to correct every year for the emissions that have taken place in that. And the 4th assessment point had none of the slow feedbacks in the models, okay? So, and no one that I've talked to understood that. They just thought you could default to the IPCC report. Many of you probably know that the IPCC, and I was a lead author of the chapter on equity, and they didn't break in the fifth assessment, they didn't do what they did in the third assessment. They talked about carbon targets for the whole world. So, let's see. Let me go ahead. People do not understand the following thing. What happened in Paris changed everything fundamentally, because everyone thought you didn't have to seriously talk about it because you could tighten the target when it became too late, okay? So everyone said, yeah, we know we don't have this right, but in Paris, they said 1.5 degrees, and Paris went to a 1.5 degree C warming because the slow feedbacks were starting to appear at 1 degree centigrade, okay? And so, but once they set a carbon target of 1.5 and you realize that you're running out of time for it, there should have been a flag. It should have been the first lead in the New York Times, but it still hasn't appeared. The lead should be, we've reached that point where it's too late to not think about a warming limit, okay? That time that we thought may come came. And what didn't get out was how that changed how you actually calculate your target. Everyone still thinks you can do it the same old way. And people don't understand that the target, every target is implicitly a position on two issues which changes how environmental organizations work. I've been an environmental lawyer for several governments, and the environmental policymaker could always go down the hall and ask the scientists what the target should be. Most of the targets were set on science. How many cancer deaths, okay? Or you could do a model. But climate is really, really different. It requires target setting of a completely different kind. It requires you to answer two questions which the scientists cannot answer. The first question is, what is the warming limit that your target is designed to meet? Whether you like it or not, whether you ignore it or not, the target already is a position on a carbon budget. If you're saying I can increase the warming so that the atmospheric concentration goes from 400 to 460 parts per million because of my target, the target already is a position on a carbon budget. Asking you to think about a carbon budget is not something new. It's already implicit in asking you to set a target. But you could ignore it before, but you can't ignore it anymore. Okay. Every target is also a position on what your fair share of the dwindling carbon budget is. Whether you like it or not, you're taking a position on equity. And there's no reason in the world, if you've agreed to set a target in which you've agreed to reach a warming limit and to base it on equity, there is no excuse for not asking governments to explain explicitly how your target relates to ambition and to equity. And so the more we've thought about this, I'm working with 5 researchers from around the world. We just put a paper, they include Prue Taylor from the University of Auckland, 2 researchers from Griffith University and 1 from Adelaide. And how do you set a target? My experience is you would think everyone understands this, but very few people really understand this. And if you don't understand it, you're not likely to do it. And if you're not likely to do it, there's no way that the transparency mechanisms in the Paris Accord can work. If you don't get governments to expressly explain what they did on these steps, they're likely to do what they did in the INDCs, make claims that they're fair and ambitious enough, but you can't figure out how it linked to what in fact happened. So there are 5 steps that every target we should expect governments to do, because whether you like it or not, you're already taking a positions on these issues. Whether you like it or not, your promise to achieve a warming limit implicitly is a promise to make a decision on these issues. It's not a new commitment, it's already implicitly required. You probably know that, so the 2 things that setting a climate target are different is that there are two issues that every position is implicitly a position of that the scientists can't answer. The first is, what is the warming limit? The warming limit is not a scientific question. It's implicitly a position on how much harm you're going to cause other people. At its heart, a warming limit is a position about how much damage you can do to other people. At the heart of climate target setting, unlike toxicology setting, are two issues that are screaming for attention to see it not as a scientific issue, but as an ethical and moral question. The first is, what is the warming limit your target is seeking to achieve? So if you, as someone told me 2 weeks ago, I'll just set it at 80% by 2050, well, you're implicitly taking a position on how much the atmospheric level can raise. Okay, you're giving yourself permission. You're taking a position on a carbon budget, whether you like it or not. The warming limit is implicitly a moral position because it's a position on who you think you can hurt. Okay, any warming is going to hurt someone. Okay, the second position is what is your fair share. Climate change is a pie slice cutting process. It's not simply a scientific process. At stake, as you all know, in the warming limit is there's now evidence that some of the nonlinear triggers are starting to appear. Okay, and so there's a lot at stake between 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade. In fact, why the whole world agreed in Paris is because many countries were screaming that 2 degrees is a death sentence for us. Okay, so if you pick a target somewhere between 1.5 degrees centigrade, you cannot look at self-interest alone. Okay, that's morally inappropriate. It's implicitly, whether you like it or not, a position on a moral issue. There's a lot at stake between 1.5 and 2 degrees. So the first step is we should ask everyone to do explicitly is, what's the warming limit that your target will in fact achieve? Now, you don't have to do these steps in order. You can, most target setting is you move between steps, but there are 5 steps that have a certain logic to it. One is every target is implicitly a position on a warming limit. And there's a lot at stake at that. If an NDC comes in, we should ask all countries to say explicitly, what is the warming limit? And if it's not 1.5 degrees centigrade, why not? Okay, are you saying you can't do it? And by the way, there are self-interested kind of issues, but they're not in the warming limit step. They're in the equity and common differential responsibility step, I think. All countries, including developing countries, agreed in Paris. They changed how differentiation has been achieved, but all the countries agreed to achieve the warming limit of the goal, of the target. They can, the developing countries can now, the only real change is when they have to have economy-wide targets. But even the developed countries agreed to achieve the warming limit. So it's more than reasonable to ask countries, what is the warming limit, and how quantitatively does the number that you come up with link to the warming limit? There's a lot at stake at the warming limit. I won't go through it. The methane is starting to release. There's some evidence that's really scary, that the ability, half of the carbon, as you know, is going into the oceans and into the forests. And it's too early to tell, but it looks like the ability of half of the sinks is starting to shrink. And we may be really speeding up this. So there's a lot at stake at what the warming limit is. And governments should be expected to explain it. Forests are dying. As the forests die, the sink dies. As the oceans get warmer, the ocean sink gets worse. Anyway, okay. So I'm going to show you this slide. Here's something very, very, very few people in the United States understand, and the press is not reporting on, particularly in terms of its world historical significance. If you got to limit the warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade because you don't like what's going to happen, the reduction rate is staggering for the world. Okay, now I have a chart up here. You'll have different slopes on the chart depending upon what assumptions on a carbon budget were made, which is the second step of this. So some of the curves will be a little bit different than this one, but no matter which curve, no matter which reasonable carbon budget you select, the curves look amazing. On this slide, you see 4 reduction curves. The yellow one on the right of the slide is where the INDCs will take you. The red dotted line is what a 2 degrees centigrade at a 50% probability would be. The blue dotted line is a 2 degrees centigrade at a 66% probability. And the green dotted line is 1.5 degrees at a 50% probability. Look at the depths of the reduction. Why isn't this a front page story every day? Why is there no talk in the United States, not only about this, but the second part of this, and that's the speed of the reduction. The second step you have to do, whether you like it or not, if you're taking a position on a warming limit, you're taking a position on a carbon budget. Okay. I don't know anyone that I've run into that knows how you do that in any scientifically responsible way. Well, IPCC published in its summary for policymakers and working group 1, the carbon budgets. That's a place to start. And this shows you different, but what people miss is even those numbers are only good to, I think, about 2007, and you have to remove 515 gigatons to take you to 2011, which the IPCC report acknowledges, and to take it up to the present, you have to reduce the budget. The budget is shrinking. It's shrinking rapidly. Okay, why isn't this the #1 press story? If you've agreed to limit the warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. This is part of the budget. I have yet to hear anyone. I've been in the middle of this for 30 years at the highest levels in the United States. I was a negotiator at the UN for the Clinton administration. I see none of the environmental groups talking about what I'm about to talk about. Okay, that the shrinking, it's not only the magnitude, it's the speed. Because it's a carbon budget that you have to reduce. You have to reduce carbon budgets. Okay, and as I said, a target is a tactic where you're figuring out what slice of the pie is. But if you look at the slides, the carbon budgets are shrinking. And if you don't take your fair share, either the practical significance of that, either someone's got to make up your fair share, or you exceed the warming limit. The significance of a shrinking carbon budget, the policy significance of the task of setting a target at the national level, at least in my experience, is not understood. It's not being talked about. But why I'm here today is you've got to make people talk about it, or there's no hope of making the transparency mechanisms work, in my view. And here's the other thing that is really scary. You go to 0 for 2 degree C warming at current global emissions rates of 40 gigatons in 5.2 years. That's all has left for 1.5 degrees centigrade, according to UNEP. 2 degrees centigrade, you go to 0 at 20.3 years. This is really scary stuff. So, picking the budget and what you do with the budget should be expressly stated as part of setting the target. We need to get negotiators to get countries to do this expressly. And by the way, if you don't understand this, you can't criticize your government. Okay, in all 23 countries, we concluded the NGOs did not understand this. Otherwise, they would have gone at the INDC with much more rigor. Okay. You also have to identify an emissions reduction pathway. Now, why is that important? And why is that new in a way that was not true of how you set a target 10 years ago? It's new because the budget is shrinking. Okay, if you wait till the end of a 30 or 40-year period to achieve your reductions, you've eaten a lot of that shrinking carbon budget. The fact that it's a budget requires you to think clearly about not only the quantity of reductions, but the speed, because if you wait and you say you're going to reduce it magically in 2050, you've eaten much, much more of your remaining carbon budget. So the third thing countries should do and express is to identify the emissions reduction pathway. It's the only way you can think clearly about their INDC. And then you have to adjust the carbon budget for equity. And, okay, I want to go back 1 second. Equity is not only legally and morally required, it's practically required. To give you any hope, I want to go back to this chart. Okay, you see these are the reductions for the whole world. So UNEP has now said that to have any chance of limiting the warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade, all the main greenhouse gases have to be zero between 2045 and 2050. But that is for the whole world, okay? When you look at this chart, underneath this charts are current emissions levels, and you look at it and you say, oh my God, the developed countries have got to go faster. If there's any hope, so equity is not, if there's any hope of meeting it, it's not just that equity is fair and just. It's not just that justice would require an equity step. Justice is required as a practical step. Why isn't the justice? I have here almost zero talk about the practical implications of equity and justice for the US target. The New York Times is not reporting on it. Anyone that's been coming here for the last 5 years know that that is the big issue. It's the North-South divide, which is at the center of the discussions. But at domestic level, I see no one, almost no one, that really understands practically the significance of that. So I could say a lot about equity and justice and what it would require of the United States. And by the way, IPCC had 2 new chapters in it. You should all know about it. They are really central. There's a new chapter on justice, a new chapter on equity. They contained really important language in it to limit the nonsense that's going on here. There'll still be nonsense, but to limit the nonsense, the chapter on justice says economic reasoning doesn't deal with justice issues. It says that expressly, okay? The equity issue, equity is a hotly contested term. Everyone's been trying to negotiate it here. But IPCC, I was an author for the chapter on equity. And this is what the ethics and philosophical literature says. Just because people disagree what distributive justice requires doesn't mean that anything goes. It doesn't mean economic self-interest goes. What IPCC says that equity could only mean 4 things after synthesizing the equity literature: historic responsibility, equality, capacity, and the rights of developing countries to develop. Countries are going to try to get off the hook on the equity basis. Most of the developed countries, I predict, will not take the equity thing seriously to adjust their emissions. Developing countries we've seen seem to think that equity means that they don't have to do anything. And compared to the developed countries, that's almost true, but there's a lot of wasted emissions. We want to make this work. You want to get people to explain expressly how they decided what the size of their pie is, what express considerations they took into account on the equity step. Okay. And IPCC said it could only mean 1 of 4 things. It doesn't mean the things that countries want it to mean. So the 4th step that we want countries to be express about is to get them to explain expressly and quantitatively how they adjusted what would otherwise be required of them by the carbon budget that they selected, and on what basis they did it. I could talk all day about how completely outrageous the United States has been on the equity step, but what really gets me upset is that no one is talking about it in any serious way. This, by the way, is historical emissions. The thing you'll hear in the United States all the time, we shouldn't have to do it unless China does it. And then you'll hear the claim it won't make any difference if the United States reduces emission, China doesn't. That's false. The U.S. is raising the water in the bathtub, regardless of what China does. And this is a chart that shows China's historical emissions compared to the U.S. historical emissions. No matter if you took equity seriously, the U.S. would have to do. This is a chart that shows you a greenhouse gas 2-degree warming and where the IPCs are taking. If you notice, between the EU, USA, India, and China, the whole budget is consumed for the rest of the world, okay, if you don't take equity into account. So equity is not simply legally and morally required, it's practically required, and we are not talking about it. No one is talking about what's wrong with Obama, let alone, just having to think about it pains me, the Trump administration position on these issues, okay? I think the most lenient, if you go through these steps, I've been inviting people to ask me what they think the US target should be. And I can make a very strong case for a very, very, very lenient US target. It should be carbon neutral as soon as possible, but no later than 2040 for the US position, okay? And so I'm going to end there and turn it over to my esteemed colleague. But the point I'm trying to make is that I'm asking all you here to help me figure out how to turn up the volume on how you actually set a target that in terms of ambition and equity, and how do we get these issues into the negotiations that are going on around transparency. One last thought, how did we get here? How is the position so bad? I'm trying to organize an event. If anyone's here interested in coming, I would encourage you to do it. There's something called the Climate Change Disinformation Campaign in the United States. Sociologists have now done really good, serious research on how they did it, who funded it, what their tactics were, the tactics it's just so outrageously immoral what's been going on. And it's been largely the fossil fuel companies, some countries more than others, the Koch brothers and Exxon and the American Petroleum Institute and about 10 right-wing free market fundamentalist foundations have been funding. I can't think of words that I could express strong enough how criminal I think this effort has been in the United States. It also spread to Canada, Australia, and I think a little bit New Zealand also, and a little bit in Europe. But they have done enormous, enormous, enormous damage. The U.S. would have set a target 15 years ago. I was on the U.S. delegation, but the political backlash created by the disinformation campaign stopped it, okay? And so besides, at the top of my list of the two most practical things we need to do, number one is to get people to understand the urgency of the problem entailed by a carbon budget and get governments to seriously link their target to that urgency. And if we're going to make the stock take work, we've got to figure out a way to have them. And the next thing we've got to do, I think, is help people understand the crime against humanity. I'm actually a lawyer, and I've written pieces what kind of crime it is. It doesn't actually fit any real crime, the existing crime, I don't think, but it should be a crime, what they did. They completely lied. It's not skepticism, it's disinformation. I'll just give you two examples of it quickly. They claim that over and over again, I've been at meetings where they claim the whole science was a hoax, We have every Academy of Science in the world and 150 scientific organizations and the UN and I sat at the microphone. I was sitting at the microphone, 1997, representing the United States at 2 o'clock in the morning when we were debating for the first time politically. It was not in the climate negotiations, it was from the Commission on Sustainable Development, whether the evidence was that it was the human caused. This is 20 years ago. We had to go back between the United States and Iran and even Iraq. The evidence is completely overwhelming that this is human caused, not natural variability. There's 15 or 20 independent lines of evidence. They all scream for the obviousness it's human caused, but yet you have politicians saying there's no evidence it's human caused, and you have front groups and think tanks and an incredibly sophisticated disinformation campaign, which has been funded by the fossil fuel companies. I think we all should work to raise the visibility of the outrageousness of what has been going on in the United States. In any event, okay, so I've asked a good friend of mine to respond to all of this. Dr. Graham Kennedy is a PhD in international relations from the Fletcher School for Law and Diplomacy. He's been a researcher at several universities. He's now a member of the New Zealand Parliament. He's been engaged in these issues for a very long time. He's highly respected among my most respected friends, so I'm honored for you here to come and respond. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Don, and good evening, everybody. The point I would make is essentially to agree with Don's central message, which is that unless and until the governments of the world portrayed here at successive COPs bite the bullet and pick up on the concept of the global carbon budget and the requirement to divide it up according to equity and the other principles in the 92 Framework Convention. Until that occurs, we will never have the required, what I would call, navigational compass to achieve the goal. I don't distinguish between the 2 degrees and 1.5. I see that as a continuum. Scientists, by and large, tend to say we are locked in to 1.5. We have a chance of staying below 2 degrees, and we have a chance of returning to 1.5 and below 1.5. But as long as these negotiations reflect the traditional Westphalian, competitive, economic, trade-oriented mindset in traditional diplomacy, as long as that continues, we will not succeed. We will not adopt the global carbon budget. The point about climate change is that we are confronted for the first time, not the first time chronologically, but the first time in a major issue of survival, with a global commons problem. You will not solve the global commons problem by a traditional, competitive, Westphalian, trade-oriented method. So we've got a requirement to do a qualitative change on this. And the second point where Don is right is that the public and the media in all our countries have not picked up on this. And I can assure you that in politics back in New Zealand, this issue is not on the forefront. What is a method by which we argue the issue of climate change in, I think, precisely the wrong way. There are 3 questions. And we start with question 3. and we address question 3 neurotically. And that is, what are the policy measures and what is it going to cost me? Whether it's the government or the firm or the farm or the household, what's it going to cost me? And even as recently as organizing or compiling the INDC, in our case, the background economic papers prepared to inform the government address that. That's question 3. What we should be doing is asking question 1 and then question 2 and then question 3. And question 1 is, as Don says, what is the global carbon budget and how is it to be divided up? What is each country's national responsibility level? Prefer to avoid the phrase fair share because it is so pejorative. And I think a more formal phrase of national responsibility level and that share of the global carbon budget is question 1. Question 2 is, what is our maximum theoretical domestic mitigation potential within that figure? For some developing countries, the figure on question 2 will be greater than the figure on question 1, in which case they would receive a deficit. For all developed countries, the answer to question 1 is the level is far, far higher than question 2. What is your domestic mitigation potential? And then question 3, indeed, is what are the policies to get to question 2? What are the effective policies for a country to realize its maximum theoretical mitigation potential? But 99% of the debate in New Zealand, and I believe elsewhere, certainly in the United States, Canada, and Australia, less so in Europe, 99% of the debate is on question 3. So if we adopt that methodology, question 1, then to question 2, then to question 3, we start to get clarity as to what we need to do. And it is frightening, as Don says. It is frightening, which is why it's in the too hard basket, both at the United Nations and even back home. But there is no choice. It has to be done. I initiated some research in New Zealand a year ago where we adopted this approach with question 1, then question 2, then question 3. And we looked at the global carbon budget. And then we looked at the various models of applying equity. Well, actually, some of them, we looked at 7 models. The first was a country count, where New Zealand, for example, was 195th of the global contribution. Second was the population per capita contribution, where New Zealand is 0.06% of the global population. The third is the GDP-based contribution. New Zealand is 0.15%. The fourth was the current emissions-based approach, 0.16%. Fifth was the cumulative emissions-based approach, 0.19%. You can see just marginal differences in each case. And the final 2, which were the 2 that I think are more sophisticated and required more investigation, was obviously the contraction and convergence approach, which the British have adopted in their binding legislation based on a reduction of their emissions per capita of about 7 to 8 to 2.4. And the 2.4 will be a global figure in 2050, and the UK gets down to that. And the last one is arguably the most sophisticated of all, which many of you may know, is the Climate Equity Reference Project and Framework, the CER framework, where there is a series of assumptions, basically 9 assumptions, and it has to do with the level of global ambition you choose between 1.5 and 2 degrees, or the G8 pathway, and you wouldn't want to do that. Second, the responsibility and capacity, where the choice in responsibility versus capacity is either 100% responsibility or 50% responsibility, 50% capacity, or 100% capacity. Third is the progressivity between and within countries, whether there's a no development threshold or a $7,500 development threshold, and so on. And then the historical responsibility is the final one, choosing between your source year of 1850, 1950, or 1990. So we did some work. We adopted the climate equity reference framework, and we did some work on it. And just to see what it would mean for New Zealand, and I'll give you quickly the answers. Based on a 2-degree pathway, global gross emissions, and I'm not talking about the total budget now, I'm talking about the year 2030 slice out of the global carbon budget, because we were working out what our NDC should be in 2030. So if you take 2030, the global gross emissions based on the global carbon budget, currently projected to be 68.3 gigatons, would need to fall to 35.7 gigatons. And that takes you down to 4.3 tons per capita. Based on the New Zealand Responsibility Capacity Index of 0.256, that is to say, New Zealand's share of the global carbon budget is 0.256%. Coming out of the choice of those parameters that I mentioned and the choices we made, New Zealand's gross emissions, currently projected to be 95.4 megatons, will need to fall to 18.0 megatons, down to 3.5. Our current INDC is specified for 2030 at 54. We're talking gross emissions, not net. It is possible to do the net. We have done them, but it would confuse matters for the moment. So just talking about gross emissions. So baseline projection, 95 megatons for New Zealand. Current NDC, 54. Requirement for 2 degrees, based on the climate equity reference framework, 18. That's the nature of the challenge. That's the magnitude of the challenge for my small country. It is massive. 18 megatons. And the current's 95. Well, no. Current is 2014 is about, I think it's 80, gross is 85. Yeah, projected to continue to go up. And as I say, the NDC takes it down to 54, but the decent equitable share of the global carbon budget for New Zealand would be 18. That's the distinction. We went on to question 2. What would be the maximum theoretical domestic mitigation New Zealand could conceivably do? And we said, let us not get bogged down on question 3. Let us just ask, what is the theoretical maximum abatement potential? Adopting a set of benign assumptions. In the best of all worlds, 5 benign assumptions. Assumption 1, optimal, effective policy measures. That's the big heroic assumption. That's question 3. We'll just set that, just swallow and move on. Assumption 2, a genuine political consensus across parties so that policy predictability can be guaranteed. Not to say identical policies, but a broad consensus. European style, you might say. Assumption 3, positive, collaborative, private-public sector collaboration. Assumption 4, continuing linear improvements in technology. No gee whiz technological fix. And 5, best practices across society. Farm, firm, household. Adopting those 5 assumptions, what would New Zealand's maximum possible domestic mitigation get us down to? And the answer was 23. You could conceivably get New Zealand's emissions by 2030 down to 23, which means that we would have a gap of 5 from 23 down to 18 to make up the shortfall. And you would do that, depending on your preference and taste, through international carbon trading or climate financing. You could equate it dollar for ton and simply do it entirely in terms of green climate financing. Or you could do a mix. But there would be a gap. It has to be realized that there are countries, and this our research demonstrated, that it's just not possible for New Zealand to, simply through domestic mitigation, achieve what our national responsibility level would be. But you could get remarkably close, and closer than I expected when we started that study. So that's our experience, and everything about our research that we did, it runs to 25 pages with 50 pages of annexes, and it's pretty dense. But everything in it reinforces, in my view, exactly what Don has been saying with regard to the US and with regard to the world. That unless and until we intellectually adopt this approach, and we are not doing that here yet, we are engaging in traditional diplomacy. And we have extraordinarily intelligent and professional colleagues here, diplomats, who are doing this. But unless we get the political mandate and empowerment for us to move this work that is done in the IPCC and in the research institutes and in universities into the negotiating machinery, we won't make that change. Thank you.
Well, thank you. What year was you have to achieve it? By what year?
Yeah, well, the year we were using for this was 2030 because of the INDCs. Yeah.
Okay. Now that I've depressed myself and probably all of you, a couple people I can see have experience with this process. I'd like comments about what I've said in terms of your experience with what's going on here. If you want to come up and say a few words. Can I ask you? Nope. Any? So, yes.
Thank you. So with the lack of national will or understanding of actually how to set a target and achieve it, and maybe even, follow through with the MRV process, which is sadly lacking. And there is a lot of movement with subnationals to take actions. And so would these steps that both of you have in different ways suggested, could subnationals also use these formulas in terms of deciding, for example, the state of California, other states have reduction targets, as do companies, but states specifically. So can they use this formula for seeing if they are in track to, reduce 40% by 2030?
I'll go first. Listen, when I give this speech, I usually end where I ended, and I said, before you slit your wrists, okay, there's some hope out there. And particularly at the local government level around the world, there's some wonderful things starting to happen. And more countries have targeted numbers for non-fossil fuels. So there are things that can happen. But I think if you look at what we were talking about, there's no hope unless you convince civil society we need an all hands on deck, World War II kind of mobilization of all levels of government to get to the numbers that we need. So there is reason that we could minimize the damage, particularly with what's happening with non-fossil fuel. There's some cities in countries I would have never guessed that have set close to zero targets. There's some really good stuff happening. Where it is happening, in my experience, it's happening mostly at the local level. Do you have any?
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, it is entirely possible, because the nation state is an artifice. It's just a fiction. And so, and California is probably 20 or 40 times bigger than New Zealand, and China's population is 222,000 times higher than Tuvalu's population. So when we have 197 states parties here, and that range, and we all know it, we go into those rooms, and we are acutely and poignantly conscious of the fact that there are 60 or 80 people in that room representing 7 billion people, discussing and arguing the toss on the way forward, but on traditional grounds. And so we need that turnaround. And I think personally that one of the reasons that we're not making the progress we need is because we've got a methodological problem, where we are negotiating since '92, the convention and Kyoto and Paris treaties along traditional lines of nation-state legal obligations. Well, there are either binding legal obligations top-down, which is out of favor, and bottom-up, but we're still negotiating that in the form of the identity of the nation-state. And so we take legal obligations here. But when it comes to the implementation, we adopt the concept of global least cost. And then we use the market, or aspire to use the market, based on global least cost. Now, if you use the market, it is rational to think we will aspire to global least cost. But there is no global least cost. It has not been developed. And so everybody is second-guessing everybody else. New Zealand aluminium smelter, do we close it? If we do, it goes to China. And on this, I wouldn't say mythical, but this on this non-robust notion of global least cost, that keeps us going in New Zealand. So the short answer is that any entity, whether it's California at the state level, but also down to the firm, the corporate, can undertake, and this is what's going on. I mean, the good news is that there has been a sea change, setting aside developments of this week, which we might wish to regard as a blip. There is a global movement, and it's recognizing that the denialism had been falling away, and we were en route post-Paris to implementation, and we all have that mindset. And I think whether you use if you get it down to the level of the corporation or the individual or the household, my own take is that the concept of the ecological footprint is the best one to use. It's very closely correlated to your carbon footprint, and you can do the carbon footprint. We do back home. I mean, I offset these long hauls. I pay $2,000 a year, pretty much, to offset that. But the ecological footprint gives you a broader idea of the raw resources and the carbon, climate emissions, and other aspects. And we can, and most corporations these days are moving along those lines, and some very impressively. So the bottom-up approach is fine. I just have this abiding belief that, and I actually think that that is the practical way. But if we don't, and it's not a wise thing to use the phrase top-down, I just fundamentally believe that if we don't have the global carbon budget and its divvy up on equity for your national responsibility level, call that a navigational compass for the bottom-up. And if we don't have it, and you just pretend to be using bottom-up, we will not know where we're going, and we won't be able to calibrate how well we're doing, and we'll be lost.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the presentation, for giving me the chance for asking the question. Considering the fact that nevertheless China is one of the least developed countries, 77 plus China, and it is China is pushing fast in the serial activities and one of the great emitters countries. How can we tackle this? Because China has great contribution to greenhouse gases emission and global warming. Also, USA, from historical point of view, recently joined the climate change community, global communities, by ratifying Paris Agreement. What do you think the USA contribution should do to reduce this greenhouse gases emission and to keep the warming by less to 2 degrees centigrade? One of the appropriate measures to tackle this greenhouse gas emission are the enhancing of the developing countries to have access to carbon credits by many low carbon mitigation projects and programs. But the modalities to enable these countries to have access to this global finance, like CDM and voluntary and mandatory markets, are no longer enhanced or needs a lot of talk. This point should be considered because CDM should be upgraded within this negotiation. Thank you very much.
I'm not so sure I understood the reference to Palestine and China. That as I understood it, you're saying that China's pressuring Pakistan to do something, but it's not doing it itself. Was that the first part of what you said?
China is including the group of 77 plus 1.
Okay.
LDCs, least developed countries, but it is not least developed countries actually.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that's a fair comment. I've wondered about that myself. That's the other part of it was okay. So your point about getting all the modalities in place to help developing countries with their carbon situation is obviously a huge and important topic. I haven't been following the negotiations, so I don't know what the state of affairs are. My guess is it's not much better, that the money hasn't been made concrete yet. Okay, so there's not much progress on that. But if you look at these numbers, there's no way we're going to limit the warming until the developed countries help developing countries with whatever their NDC is. I mean, it's so obvious to me. And that's another surprising, very little discussed topic in the United States. Okay, there's almost no one is talking about seriously what the U.S. obligation would be to finance, if it took seriously its both legal and moral obligation and practical obligation to help developing countries move technology transfer into. I continue to shake my head. There's at the lack of media coverage on those issues in the United States.
Sorry. I found the presentation, if realistic, starkly realistic. And so but I'd just like to ask some questions regarding the New Zealand reflection. I found that when you spoke about the importance of linear technological development and the potential for a nation to indicate what its real capacities were. Considering New Zealand, and I just know it in a superficial sense, have you really considered the restoration of ecosystems, the sense of not just mitigation, but in terms of sinks that are being presently a great hope for me in terms of how vastly they would improve our chances. And as I think of New Zealand, I don't think of it as monumentally given over to total industrialization. So I'm just wondering how much of that figured into your calculations.
Yeah, a lot. New Zealand, for a developed country, New Zealand is unique, if that's the right word. It's probably better to use the word extreme in its carbon profile, because it's of its gross emissions, just under 50%, about 48%, is agriculture, of which 2/3 is methane, and 1/3 nitrous oxide. And those two, especially methane, is, as you know, intractable to try to bring down. The next one down, so that's about 48% from memory. The next one down would, in the OECD or the Annex 1 would be Ireland at, I think, 31%, and then down to 5% or so in the range. So it gives you a bit of an idea of the particular challenge we have. Agriculture was at the very, very beginning intended to be brought into the emissions trading scheme in 2008. Then it was deferred. It never actually did come in. Then it was deferred, and now it's actually been taken out of any prospect. That may change, but it's the case. So there's 50% of your emissions that are not being dealt with. The other 50% are. But the other, between a rock and a hard place, the other part is that our electricity, I think we're the 3rd highest in the world for renewable electricity, primarily from hydro and to some extent geothermal and wind and solar, but mainly it's hydro. So there's limited scope for improving on that too. Where our biggest potential for, setting agriculture aside for the moment, biggest potential is in transport fuels efficiency to emulate Europe in our car and truck fleet, and VKMs and so on, to really bring that down. And you could almost halve our gross emissions by 2030 on that basis. And then the other one, as you more or less were alluding to, is forestry for immediate sequestration. The potential for that is massive. And you could, for example, bring your transport down from 34 megatons to 19. So there's the better part of 14 megatons out of 85, which is very significant. But when you take on forestry and you go to gross to net and you bring in forestry, we did 12 scenarios of forestry. We could plant 50,000 hectares a year, 1.3 million by 2030, and then 12 scenarios of different species mix and different management of those species. And the range varied between about a couple of we're talking 2030 sequestration between a couple of megatons and 30 megatons. If you really wanted to go flat out to it and just do the purely high sequestering eucalyptus and pine, which is not everybody's favorite cup of tea in New Zealand, up against the biodiversity strategy as well. But it would get up to 30 megatons, which is quite massive when you're talking about New Zealand's 80 odd or megatons. So the answer, then moving from those figures to the politics of it, I would affirm what I think's behind your comment, namely that the best way to go on this stuff in terms of selling it in public receptivity is the co-benefit scenarios, where with the dairy intensification, we've got major problems now with water quality, local water quality, rivers and lakes, and it's becoming a major political issue. The ability of the kids, when I was a kid, to swim, and now you're warned off it. So the idea is to take, for example, ecosystem approach and use a water basin and slap a nitrate level cap on it, which results in destocking. And incidentally, the studies have also shown that destocking of intensive dairy, actually from 2.8 per hectare to 2 per hectare, actually will increase the profit and loss. So it's just a matter of awareness and mentality for individuals, farms and so on, to make those moves. So if you use the local environmental co-benefit scenario and move on that, much more palatable politically than thumping the table about emissions reductions. But the emissions reductions follow.
I understood your question also to include, I thought that's quite interesting, whether if in fact you spent more energy on ecosystem restoration, doesn't it help enormously with the mitigation problem? Doesn't it reduce? And I can tell you that I was surprised in Paris and the IPCC reports that they all now include carbon sequestration to get to zero. And that, as you well know, 4 or 5 years ago, most people were saying we can't rely upon carbon sequestration. But everyone is relying on carbon sequestration in the carbon budgets, my understanding. But there are really open questions, I think, about how much of the need for mitigation you can get through biological stuff. There's still big open questions, I think. Would you agree?
Yes, I'll just add one thing. It's a time frame issue, and it's in terms of the forestry and the sequestration, because it just buys you time, because the carbon gets returned in due course. So you can, and we have done all sorts of curvatures, but if you take the approach, and I do, that the magnitude and the urgency of the global ecological crisis is such that, as Don was saying, the AR4 said basically global emissions meant to peak by 2020, and if they meant to peak by either 2020 or 2030, or global carbon neutrality by 2050, max 2040, then I don't know how else you're going to do it other than that quick fix on sequestration through massive afforestation and reduced deforestation to buy us those 20 years while we work on other technologies.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. And I think it's true what was said about the media coverage, that there is no media coverage on these themes. But I was wondering that maybe this is also a science world responsibility that probably is not pushing enough toward the media world to make them speak about these topics and problems. And I don't know if this is the reality. I wanted to ask if this is the case, or that maybe you're doing this push, but they are not answering. They don't want to cover this topic because they think it's not interesting for the public. Thanks.
I think I was talking to you about a similar question before, whether the policymakers and the researchers.
Sorry, I cannot hear you.
We were just talking about that very question in the hallway. Duncan was sharing his views about the failure to connect the research community with the policymakers. I also see a problem on the researcher side of it too. I run a large consortium of 40 universities on environmental issues, and they often think in narrow disciplinary terms, and they don't understand, in many cases, what the policymakers need out of the science. And that's a strong statement. There are obviously some that do and are in fact pushing, but when you teach climate in the universities in Pennsylvania that I'm associated with, they're trying to teach, for instance, climate across the curriculum, but it's all still sort of very little about what policy is required. It's more about what the science is saying is in fact needed. And where you have social scientists engaged, it's in the United States, it's usually economists, not social scientists. So there are, unfortunately, the research community could even do more if it paid much more attention to what the actual policy issues are in my opinion.
No, very much. She was talking about the scientists, right? Yeah, your point was about the scientists doing more? Yes?
Yes. Yes, I was wondering that maybe the science world is not doing enough.
Well, I have to say I have a fair bit of sympathy for the scientific community. They also are between a rock and a hard place, and they've had their issues, as you may know, with 2009, just with Copenhagen and the AR4 and some of the issues relating to AR4. They are naturally, and the irony of this is that they are naturally conservative. They're meant to be, and the scientific method is a kind of a conservative, drawn-out, long-term thing. And subject, as Don was mentioning at one stage, subject to peer review. So some of these documents will be quite dated by the time, and yet they're starting to, by that stage, they're coming into the system of policy making, but they're almost becoming outdated by that stage. So, and the other point is that it is not their nature to be in the public eye, by and large, with some exceptions. Their instinct is to do research in a low-key way and constantly put it up for falsification and hypothesis and falsification and try it again. And you almost need not to be in the public arena to be able to do that properly. So it isn't their instinct. And the experience of the IPCC has tended to increase that instinct with some exceptions. So there is this, I think there's this no man's land between the scientific community and the policy-making community. And I think there's scope for UN leadership, both in the UNFCCC in Bonn and in the Secretariat in New York, for bringing the work of, not just of IPCC scientists, but of the research institutes and so on, explicitly into UN documentation as background material. So otherwise it's just subliminal to the negotiators. They might have read it 3 months earlier, put it on the shelf, and come here with their briefs. But if it's UN documentation in front of them, it's a different story. And so I think we shouldn't try and goad the scientists into coming into the media and public arena where they can get buffeted around, but we should have a system through UN leadership for their work to be more automatically and vigorously and assertively brought into the UN negotiations.
I could sure bore you for 3 or 4 days by talking about that how much science you need is not a scientific question. It's a moral question at its core, and most scientists don't understand that. That's a hell of a claim, but I've tested it. I had a $50,000 grant to test scientists if they understood that when you're facing uncertainty, morality would require you to think about things that scientists are not taught to think about when they do their science. They're trying to follow the norms of their science and get certain levels of statistical correlation. But most human problems, scientists are asked, what do you do where the harms could be catastrophic? You can't get the science because the scientific systems are really complicated. At the heart of every scientific uncertainty question are 2 moral questions that, unfortunately, my first degree was in engineering science. I wouldn't knew these questions if someone hit me over the head with them. I wasn't taught to think about it this way. The question is, who should have the burden of proof, and how much proof do you need which forces you to ask the question, what's at stake? Have the people consented to it? It forces you to ask the question, if you wait, does the problem get worse? If the problem gets worse, the longer you wait, do the victims have a right to consent to be put at risk? At the heart of all of these uncertainty questions are deep and obvious ethical and moral questions that most engineers and scientists don't know how to talk about them. In fact, they're taught not to talk about them. They're often taught to be quiet until they have certain levels of statistical proof and correlation. So, and the other thing that's been going on is the fossil fuel companies have been beating them over the head for not having 95% confidence levels at every claim they make, and they've been viciously bullied. I taught at Penn State University. We have been viciously bullied. I have been viciously bullied. I mean, really nasty. I'll just tell you one story it's just so amazing. I wrote a paper that said, what kind of crime is the disinformation campaign? And it wasn't intended to be a polemic. It started off with skepticism in science. It's a good thing. We need more of it. We even need more skepticism for mainstream climate science. But this is not skepticism. This is a lying about the science. This is a reckless disregard for the truth. This is cherry picking. Okay, this is completely telling absolute lies about the science, such as that there's no evidence of human causation. But it's worked in the United States. So after I wrote my article, The Guardian picked it up and published it around the world. And every right-wing nut in the United States came after me. And it started off by, the article said on this website that Professor Brown is saying that all skeptics are criminals. That's a complete distortion of what I said. I started off by saying skepticism, real skepticism is necessary. We need more of it, but this is not skepticism. So, you know, the reason why the United States has not moved quicker, I believe, is because of this disinformation campaign. At every critical step, when we got close, about 100 think tanks and front groups got cracking, okay? And so I think we all should be talking about the disinformation campaign that started in the United States, went outside of the United States, and bringing attention to how dangerous, harmful, and morally reprehensible the whole thing is. And it is, as in fact, it's worked, I think, in making the journalists a little not telling the whole story. How could it be that every Republican candidate for president of the United States all said that climate science was a hoax? Okay, when the science of human causation is just, it's amazingly strong. There's attribution studies and fingerprint studies and isotope studies, and the projections fit the models, okay? But no one asks the politicians the obvious follow-up questions that ethics would have you ask, such as, you know, on who are you relying upon? How do you discount the value of 19 Academy of Science in the world that disagreed with the scientific review? So there's an amazing failure between for this kind of problem. Some of our best intellectual resources aren't really equipped to be really good critical thinkers about how you attack them, is my take. Thank you very much. If anyone is interested, I'm trying to organize for the 15th at 1 o'clock at a room to be decided, to gather people that are interested in the disinformation campaign. And in that meeting, we're going to try to figure, following the work of peer-reviewed sociologists, mostly have done the best work. What is the disinformation campaign? How has it worked? Why can you argue that it stopped the United States and the world? What are their tactics? What's wrong with each of their tactics? And my intention of doing this is to try to raise the volume on this whole subject. We really need to raise the volume on how irresponsible the fossil fuel companies have been. Thank you for listening to us. Thank you. It's an honor. I can see your thoughtfulness and your experience, which is great. Yeah. Fantasize how to get the press.